Good morning once again. Welcome back, and pardon the delay. Today we're looking at the determination of death, the clinical determination of death, and then the issue of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and also making the bioethical distinction between killing or allowing to die. So it's another heavy lecture. And we'll begin, as always, with a little prayer. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for your blessings, for the gift of life, and for having us here today, and for the privilege of delving into the issues of human nature that are important according to medical practice today. Continue to inspire us to seek the truth, to know the truth, and then to promote it among others, especially as it applies to the practice of medicine in the United States today. And we ask this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, so we started here on the topics at the end of life and looking at vital organs and then the most common causes of death in the United States. Now you can see that with regards to vital organs, well, that's what medicine is about, right? Trying to heal, restore vital organs, and other organs too, but the vital ones are critical. So, yes?
This is not in the email?
It's not in the email?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So I forgot to send this. I'm delayed, so I have not sent but what I send on the email usually is this. And then at the end of the lecture, I'll send you the PowerPoint in a PDF form, right?
Thank you.
Sure. So what I did not send last night was this. Sure. All right, so any questions or comments from the previous lecture? In the topic, no, again, trying to focus on end-of-life issues and where people are seriously ill or injured. Just making the distinction. So in bioethics, we talk about ordinary or proportionate means of life support, which we consider obligate ethically, or extraordinary means of life support, also known as disproportionate, also two keywords, I mean, basically the same. And the ones that are extraordinary do not obligate morally, ethically. All right. Now the difficulty is trying to find a conversion, or I'm looking for the word, to match up with the clinical terminology. All right. What doctors and nurses and just the medical profession is used to dealing with, because they don't necessarily talk in bioethical terms. They don't talk in as far as ordinary and extraordinary means of life support. Okay, it doesn't mean much to them. Rather, they talk about standard practice, standard of care, which are typically protocols that have been established, or experimental when there is no actual protocol. It's basically trial and error. That's what experimental means. And so one way that I think we can bridge that gap is by looking at the whether the vital organs are being assisted or substituted. I think that's a language that both bioethicists and the medical profession can understand and identify with. All right, so vital organ being substituted, or is it being assisted? And that's where we left it last time. Now I'm going to go a little deeper into the whole issue. Welcome. So again, we always start with the more biological or more clinical aspect, and then we build on that. You know, determination of death was not a uniform thing in the United States up until the 80s, more or less. And then there was some discrepancy between states. So various states wanted to establish a more uniform standard for declaring someone dead, clinically dead, because it has a bunch of implications. The first implication, of course, is whether to put that cadaver into a morgue or not, to freeze into very cold temperature, which if the person was not dead, it will be dead by that time, the time they're put into the morgue. Another one was, of course, legal and fiscal. Just you can think of inheritances, you can think of claiming the body, you can think of also harvesting organs, cadaveric organs now for transplantation and so forth. So it had all kinds of implication when a person is declared dead, and there was no real uniformity from state to state. Mm-hmm. And so there are certain commissions. The one that initiated the whole thing is this. It's a conference of commissioners that look at this issue on the uniformity of state laws, all right, in contrast to federal. So this is not a federal law as such, but it's rather to get the various states, because the practice of medicine does vary somewhat from state to state, and even some legal aspects vary from state to state, all right? But what doesn't vary is that people die. It doesn't matter what state we're in, we're going to die, right? And so there has to be some kind of uniformity about that declaration. And so they started a process and put some language together, run it by the AMA and the ABA, which are two main bodies that have a vested interest in the declaration of death, right? The clinical and legal declaration of death of someone. So these are state laws. So an act, typically, when you see the word act in legal terms or in government terms, it means a law project, right? It's a project of law, which starts in what branch of government? Remember your USA government class, high school government class? The legislative branch, right? The legislative branch crafts laws, which are then sent. That's can either be at the state level or the federal level. What is the legislative branch of the federal level? The U.S. Congress, right? U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. All right. At the state level, well, it's the legislative body in each state. So for us, what is the capital of Florida? Tallahassee, right? Yeah. Typically, it's interesting about the United States that most capitals of states are not in big urban areas. You'd think Miami is the highest population density by far, but it's on the opposite end of the state. In New York, for example, it's not New York City, all right? It's not even Rochester or any other of the big cities. It's a little town called Albany. So that happens a lot, that these capitals, state capitals are put. I think that had some military or logistic issues originally, so they wouldn't be easily invaded or something like that, or more easy to protect them. At any rate, this happens at the state level. So what I would say is that the state of Florida, the legislative body in Tallahassee, and many other states have adopted these. Not all states have adopted them, but the majority of states have adopted this Uniform Determination of Death Act. And for short, it's known as UDA or UDA, wherever you pronounce that, Uniform Determination of Death Act, all right? Just to point out that it's at the state level, but most states, they have to put it through their own legislation and so forth. Oh, by the way, then an act then goes to, if it's at the state level, it goes to the governor for signing and executing, right, the executive branch. If it's at the federal level, then that act goes where? To the president, also for signature, because that's the executive branch. Then that law then goes into force, and then the executive branch is in charge of enforcing the law, making sure that the law is enforced. All right. Okay. There was also at the federal level, there was feedback, and this President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Okay, so it's a big title, but this is the President of the U.S., all right? So this is a commission, it's a standing commission in the White House that advises the president on these issues of ethical problems in medicine and biomedical and behavioral research. So it includes both clinical and non-clinical stuff, right, with the research. And the bottom line is that it's one of two standards. Either standard is acceptable. Either the irreversible cessation of circulation and respiratory functions, or the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. All right? So these are the two standards, and they have either one of these. If a person has been determined by a clinician that they have either standard 1 or 2, then they can be declared dead. And so these two are known. One is known as the standard criterion or standard criteria, and the other one known as the neurological criteria. All right? So the standard criteria, also known as the cardiopulmonary criteria, or traditional or classic, goes by several names, is essentially no heartbeat and no breathing, which doesn't require much instrumentation to detect, really, just fingers on the pulse, and typically the back hand or the inside of the palm somewhere to detect if there's any breathing from the nose, any little air coming out from the nose. So it really doesn't require instrumentation. It's just left up to the clinician, who is typically a medical doctor, but in some states it can be a nurse or a nurse practitioner. In other states, it may actually be an administrator of a healthcare facility like a hospital who has medical background, who may be an MD or a nurse, all right? But even that is not too uniform, but it has to be some professional that is licensed in medicine. So again, the standard criteria is no heartbeat and no breathing. The other one, the second one, is a little more tricky, if you will. And what is your intuition with regards to the neurological criteria? Why has this been introduced as an alternative declaration for death, which was not, before the 80s and so forth, it was not really accepted? Well, Terry Shaw was one case that was very challenging, right? But the main issue here is transplantation of cadaveric organs. It's the harvesting of vital organs, right, for transplantation purposes, that the person, if you're going to pull out a heart, you want to make sure that the person is dead before you pull out that heart. Otherwise, the person will be dead once you do that. So at first, well, we'll have a whole section on transplantation. I don't want to take much time on it, but because it has now progressed to that a number of vital organs, an increasing number of vital organs can be rescued from cadavers and be transplanted successfully, all right, and save lives of other people. Then there was a need to develop an alternative standard for death, declaring someone dead. And the focus, of course, on the brain. And thank God they include the brain stem, because the brain stem also has functions of mostly the involuntary nervous system, right? Precisely controlling heartbeat and breathing. And so at first, I remember it was in the 90s that this discussion was going back and forth. I was doing my first doctorate in Rome. And they were talking about partial brain death or total brain death. I don't know if you've heard those terms. They're a little dated now, for about 20 or 30 years almost. But have you ever heard those terms, partial brain death or total brain death? Some of you have? No? Partial, total brain death? No, they were qualifying, what should qualify as brain death. And some were pushing for partial brain death, which would be just the cerebrum, basically, and the cerebellum, but not the brain stem. And others were arguing, no, total brain death, because what you have on the cerebrum is mostly the voluntary functions, and consciousness, but a number of vital organs are being maintained by the medulla, and so we have to include the medulla there. Otherwise, you could be declaring someone dead with a beating heart and pulling out that heart, and then that person was just killed. So it is total brain death, and that's why the criterion mentions it. In fact, if you notice, there's redundancy. There's the 3-level redundancy. See if you detect it. You know, forever in bioethics, it's a lot of, you have to be very, very sharp and pick up the stuff, the nuances in the wording. For example, irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including brain stem. What do you see redundancy there? Right, entire brain, including brain stem, and all functions, right? So really there's 3 levels of redundancy there to emphasize that we're talking about total brain death, right? Including the involuntary functions. And so there we go. The brain stem, which includes the pons and the medulla, okay, and controlling the involuntary functions of the body, including also digestion and other involuntary functions, which are still vital. Okay, so you see the point there, right? Now, moving forward then. Now, need to get a little philosophical here for a moment and set up the basis, because bioethics, remember that the ethical component of bioethics, ethics is one of the disciplines of philosophy, one of the branches of philosophy, right? Just like, I don't know, anatomy and physiology is one of the disciplines of medical practice or the medical school. Mm-hmm. And so we have to make some distinctions here when we're looking at the death process. First of all, from one perspective, it's a little more difficult to determine the beginning, the end of life, the beginning of life. From just organically, biologically, what is the problem at the end of life that we don't have at the beginning of life? Of any organism, okay? Again, expanding always to look at, looking for universal principles that are applicable to all life that we know on Earth. Mm-hmm. It's a numbers issue. What is your intuition biologically? What makes the end of life more difficult than the beginning of life with regards to the numbers? Give you another hint. The number of cells. Beginning of life, we start with 1 cell, right? Which we call zygote. Okay, zygote. Zygote, that should be, you should think about zygote in your sleep after this course. Excuse me. And the zygote is either dead or alive, organically, biologically, way before we even observe the zygote. All right. How about at the end of life? How many cells do we have? Approximately, give or take a few million. Any guess? What order of magnitude? 10 to the, trillions, 10 to the 12, okay. We have in the order of 10 to the 12 or more cells in our body. I mean, consider, they're all microscopic, right? So to make 6 feet worth or 5 feet worth of a human body, it's going to take a lot of cells. And you know what? They don't all die at the same time. They definitely don't die at the same time. And even so, functionally, we're really talking about organs, right? We go back to organs, remember? From cells to tissues, tissues to organs, and now organs are vital, so we can stop there for the analysis. And organs will be made up of millions, if not billions of cells themselves, right? And these organs don't all die at the same time. So even functionally, organs will die at will take different times to die. For example, what will die first normally in the body with anoxia? What's anoxia? Anoxia. Lack of oxygen, no oxygen. The A before, the prefix A, noxia, not oxygen. You know, noxia is oxygen. Anoxia is lack of oxygen, right? Hypoxia is little oxygen. Like when people drown, they have hypoxia, then they have anoxia. And so with anoxia, what happens to the body organically? What are you shutting down? Yeah, exactly. Biochemically, how do we translate life biochemically? Metabolism, body functioning, right? Anabolism and catabolism. So without any oxygen, you're going to shut down metabolism. And therefore, those organs are going to start dying. And which are the first to die? What's your intuition of the various organs that we have, organ systems? Yeah, well, the heart, the organs that would take more oxygen, right? That would use more oxygen are the first to die. In general, there's a correlation, and it's going to be the brain within 10 minutes. A person who's drowned, 5 minutes, 2, 3, 5 minutes. It's hard to tell, but it's a matter of minutes before the brain dies without oxygen. Okay. Without oxygen, 2, 3 minutes already you have severe brain damage, irreversible. That's really the tragedy about babies and children falling into pools and so forth, is brain damage is the first thing. Then another one that also within minutes is going to be the heart. Also a lot of energy. Think of the regions that produce a lot of heat, right? They're metabolizing a lot. So different organs will die at different times. Maybe kidneys may take a couple of hours, 2, 3, 4 hours. The skin may take several days. Cadavers continue to produce keratin, right? Continue to produce nail and hair, cadavers. So the skin as a whole is not dead yet, and it's a vital organ. So different organs, different vital organs die at different times. But the person as a whole, when do we declare that person dead as a whole? So it can get tricky, right? It can get tricky. So we have to say that human life is a fundamental value, but not an absolute value. Not an absolute value. What do I mean by that? This is a subtle, but it's a very important distinction between fundamental and absolute. All right? If we were an absolute value, we'd have to do what? We have to uphold it all the time. All right? For example, give me something that is an absolute value that you can think of.
The speed of light.
Yeah. In the physical world, that would be. In the moral world, for example, honesty. Honesty, integrity. We should always be honest. There should never be a situation where we are dishonest. Okay, so that's an absolute value. So human life is going to die at some point. Therefore, we cannot make it absolute in the sense that we're going to die. We cannot keep people alive forever here on Earth. All right. So is there no value to life then because it's an absolute? No, we make that distinction. It is a fundamental value. Okay, it's a fundamental value that should be upheld while it's still going on. But that value is going to cease at some point, is the point here. So human life not being an absolute value, but yes, a fundamental value that we need to protect human life regardless while life is around. All right. Then life expectancy in the United States, and this varies from country to country. Why would life expectancy vary from country to country? Yeah, exactly. It has to do with the standard of care that's available and just the overall health of the population. Some people have very ill situations, circumstances, lack of clean water, etc., sewer system, all kinds of issues that go on, right? So in the United States, the average lifespan is just under 80 right now. And for women is 81, men 76. That heart attack keeps taking a toll. And apparently, but the woman's body is more complicated biochemically, and apparently there's a certain advantage to that. It is more resilient, and it's also more used to change because of the cycling, the hormonal cycling and everything. So just in general, the woman's body lasts longer for life expectancy. But this is about after the 80s in general. So this is normalized, right? Typically it's a Gaussian distribution. You're familiar with a normal distribution, bell-shaped curve. So most people will die around these ages, and then there's going to be variation from the very young to the very old. I think I mentioned once before or several times, I don't know, what really bumped up, what medical procedure really bumped up the life expectancy of women. The one medical procedure in history that actually went from the 50s, I think it was, to the 80s, significantly for decades. Anyone know by any chance? Yeah, the C-section. Most women used to die on their last childbirth. Okay, yeah, this is going back more than 100 years, maybe 200, I don't know exactly when the C-section was invented, which first was a vertical cut, and then they decided it was much less invasive to go horizontal and then lower and so forth. So that C-section also has been perfected quite a bit. It used to be one could only have one, now you have maybe 3 or 4, I don't know. But it's been several iterations. Talk about standardizing a protocol. But the C-section is apparently the single most contributive protocol to extending the life of people on Earth, of women specifically.
There's like I read an article, there's like a 50% occurrence of C-sections in I think.
Oh yeah, that's nationwide.
Or nationwide, like
yeah,
50%.
Exactly. And about half of those are not medically indicated. It's essentially convenience or a legal issue of safety of, again, the issue of malpractice. It's becoming safer to deliver through C-section than natural. All right. Yeah. So it's a big issue how to reconcile that, because at least half of those are not medically indicated. Yeah. Which is a significant number. I mean, why should there be any procedure that's not medically indicated? Why should the medical profession become involved in that, right? Okay. All right. There's a lot more to talk about here, but we got to move forward. So let's make some clarifications here with regards to management. So the issue is to manage pain and suffering to bring relief to this situation, all right? Because a patient is terminal. We're looking at a patient who is terminally ill and how to handle the situation. So just briefly, I want to make a distinction between pain and suffering, even though these two terms are used interchangeably, both in bioethically and also in the medical profession. But they're not necessarily the same, and they may require different protocols, all right? So what is your intuition of the difference between, is there a difference between pain and suffering that you can think of?
Isn't pain like physical?
It can be more physical, right? Typically, I have a pain, all right, or I have a suffering, can be interpreted differently. A pain typically is more physical or physiological. Suffering can be more psychological or spiritual. I just make a simple little anecdote. Let's say is a married couple, they're having their first baby, and she's in labor, so she's in pain, and he's next to her, so he's not in pain, he's not having the baby, but he's suffering to see her in pain, okay? So pain and suffering are not necessarily the same, and they may require different protocols to alleviate and try to bring relief. It also is an opportunity to talk about the pastoral care team as integral to the healing team certainly in the hospital situation. The pastoral care can address psychological but mostly spiritual issues that can bring relief at the suffering level, and that will help healing. It's known that a person who is not anxious and so forth, and can bring some spiritual peace to them, will have a better immune system and overall better recovery of certain illnesses and diseases, okay? All right, another distinction is between benefit or burden, and this is typically the analysis. What are the burdens or the benefits of healing the patient? And we're going to look at some in the ERDs, which I have a copy here. I know if you brought yours, but I just got to sporadically. The ERDs talk about benefit and burden. When we looked at ordinary and extraordinary, remember, if it's not an excessive burden to the person, or if there are more benefits than burden, each person has to determine that. And that's a very subjective thing, because what can be a burden to one person may not be a burden to someone else. Some people have a lot of tolerance for pain. Other people, they start getting pain and they really freak out. They don't know how to handle it. So it's very subjective. Mm-hmm. All right. And the other aspect, of course, is very important to have a diagnosis so as to apply, right? Sometimes there is no diagnosis, it's questionable. And so that's when second opinions come in and so forth. But it's important to have a diagnosis, and then what are the hopes of recovery, the prognosis, because that will help also what kind of management is going to be done on this dying patient, all right? All right, a few other distinctions between cure and care. The medicine aims to cure people, of course, all right? But we know that there's a limit to medicine, because at some point, every patient is going to be lost. So doctors have to be very realistic about that sooner or later, they're going to lose every patient if the doctor doesn't die before their patient, okay? And so there is going to be a limit to every cure. Again, that's the state of the art, and that's why there is medical research and so forth, pushing always the limits. What used to be, well, take the C-section and childbirth, that, thanks be to God, has a great cure today, which is when a C-section is indicated. All right. So cure doesn't always obligate, because there may not be a cure, simply as that. But care is different, because care always obligates. Now, why? Because even when there's no cure, we can always offer care, all right? And care, at least if we try to distill it down to the 4 basic components of care, minimally: nutrition, hydration, shelter, and human contact. What do I mean by that? Well, without food and water, essentially the body dies, all right? But also, if we're just exposed out to the elements, we're going to die sooner or later. We're not meant to just be out exposed to the elements. So shelter, the proper shelter that is needed, a little coolness when it's very hot, or a little warmth if it's very cold outside, and not being exposed to the sun, the rain, etc. all day long, all right? So that's humane, is to offer shelter to people. It's part of standard care. But also human contact, human contact in the sense that we should not be, some people have to be isolated. Let's say they have a very contagious disease and so forth, and they have to be put in isolation or quarantine. But that doesn't mean that they are not able to, they should be deprived of interacting with people, even if it's with mask and gown or whatever, or full body suit. But to interact with people, it's part of our humanity, okay? So it's inhumane to isolate someone to the extent that they have no human interaction. And of course, with technology today, it can be done. Mm-hmm. So these are 4 basic care that should never be denied to anyone. All right. Having all that as kind of preliminary, let's jump into the topic as such of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Then beyond that, we're going to look also at hospice or palliative care as an alternative, and then a particular case of what is known as terminal sedation, all right? And then finishing with the distinction between killing or allowing to die. This is the critical bioethical distinction here. We may not kill someone, but we may allow someone to die, all right? So that's really the punchline of today's lecture. that we may not kill someone outright, but we may allow people to die. So, euthanasia. Originally, you people heard the word, I'm sure. What's your intuition about euthanasia?
When you want to die and you want to die.
Yes, right, exactly. People who want to die, all right, and then someone helps them to die or not. But it's a hot topic. It's been discussed in society today for several decades now, and some countries have actually allowed and legalized euthanasia. It started in Europe, Belgium and the Netherlands and some other countries of Europe, including Switzerland now. So originally, just very briefly, historically, the etymology of the word, the meaning, the origin and meaning of the word, thanatos is a reference to death, thanatos in Greek. El, the prefix el, means true or good or real. All right, so a true death, a good death, was the original meaning of euthanatos back in Greek society several centuries before the time of Christ. Euthanatos, and that's where the word comes from. And then it was divided into active or passive euthanasia. All right, but today basically is causing death so as to alleviate suffering. You notice that there's an intention here and there's an action. Causing death is the action. The intention behind the action is to alleviate suffering. So the alleviating suffering, is that a good thing or bad thing? Is that noble or evil? To alleviate, to seek to alleviate suffering or desire to alleviate suffering. That's good. That's a noble, that's a whole practice of medicine, right? Is to seek to alleviate pain and suffering. So to alleviate suffering is a good thing. The intention is good. But then how do we apply that? How will we implement that to cause death, to kill someone, to alleviate their suffering, is to put them out of their misery, as is said vulgarly. Well, then we've crossed a line that perhaps we shouldn't cross, because if we're actively killing someone, then that's a different story. Okay. We should try to alleviate suffering by other means other than outright killing the person. So we need to get deeper into this and start making more distinctions. Let's look at some medical definitions of active and passive euthanasia from Medicine.net, which is an online service. The practice of intentionally ending a life in order to relieve pain and suffering. So now here they see pain and suffering indistinguishable. Intentionally, so the acknowledging this is a good intention, but the intention here is also to end the life. The medical dictionary, deliberate ending of a person's suffering from an incurable disease. It includes withholding extraordinary means or heroic measures, so they're including some of the bioethical terminology, extraordinary means that we talked about. But you see, it's kind of ambiguous, because here they're talking about deliberate ending of life of a person. That sounds like killing, deliberate ending the life of a person, but then they end with allowing the patient to die. So, excuse me. My interpretation of this definition is ambiguous, because it starts with killing someone and it ends allowing the patient to die. Well, that's a big difference between those two. Between killing or allowing to die is a big difference, okay? And yet in this definition, which is a medical definition, it doesn't make a distinction between killing or allowing to die. That bioethically raises a lot of flags, really. Okay, so this issue of active or passive euthanasia, right? Traditionally, it was talked about either positive or active euthanasia, all right? Was the deliberate ending of the life of a person. So it's like the first part of this statement. But negative or passive euthanasia was withholding life preserving procedures that were standard procedures that were available and accessible to the person. So without those procedures, a person would actually die. Okay, that would be considered passive euthanasia.
Like for example, the dialysis example that we saw.
It could be if the person, assuming that the person is healthy, otherwise healthy and young and has good prospects, for example, of getting a transplant and so forth, you know, then it more goes into this person should go into dialysis because they can handle it and there's a good prognosis, there's a good prospect of recovery because she or he is up on the list, on the waiting list and so forth, okay? So, and they're denied, he's denied the dialysis. All right, that's a passive euthanasia because he needs his kidneys, he's in renal failure. Okay, and he needs that machine to keep on living. So it's a standard protocol that is available and was denied to the person. Okay. So now you have to be careful also with euphemisms, all right? How people reword things so that they take away the sting, because the word euthanasia still has kind of a sting in society. So now they talk about foregoing life-sustaining treatment, all right? Foregoing life-sustaining treatment. It takes a little more thinking to interpret this, but this is the prevailing language today in medical texts as opposed to passive euthanasia. Okay, another one, this is just from Webster's dictionary, which is probably the most famous and cited dictionary in the world, at least for the English language. The act of practice of killing or permitting the death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals, persons or domestic animals. Here it extends, of course, because it's not a medical dictionary necessarily, but it extends to pets also. Relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. So there's that, since it says practice of killing or permitting the death, right? Allowing to die, see? Killing or allowing to die. There's no distinction here in Webster. For reasons of mercy, so if you add the first words with the last words, you get mercy killing, which is another euphemism that goes around for euthanasia, mercy killing. Okay, let's move forward here. Let's look at it from the bioethical perspective, at least in the Catholic culture, of the ERDs. The two that apply more directly are 60 and 61. Euthanasia, ERD number 60, euthanasia is an action or omission that of itself or by intention causes the death in order to alleviate suffering. So it acknowledges that there's suffering involved, but the action and the intention is directed toward causing death. Catholic healthcare institutions may never condone or participate in euthanasia or assisted suicide in any way. The patients who request euthanasia should receive loving care, psychological and spiritual support, and appropriate remedies for pain and other symptoms so that they can live with dignity until the time of natural death. Excuse me. Okay, folks, I'm going to put on a little mask. I apologize for trying to not continue the cycle of infection here. Number 61 also addresses the issue of euthanasia a little further. And it talks about relieving pain and suffering. Patients should be kept as free of pain as possible so that they may die comfortably and with dignity and in the place where they wish to die. You know, about 70% of people in the United States today die in institutions. They don't die at home. So the majority of people in the United States are already dying away from home, which means in a setting that is less, in general, less comfortable, not as accessible for family and friends and so forth. So they're dying kind of isolated from their support system, which is pretty sad and tragic, no? And it kind of correlates with a better practice of medicine in general. Countries, developing countries where there's less access to healthcare, people tend to die more at home, but they're surrounded with their loved ones. So it's a more peaceful death, really. And here, ironically, paradoxically, with better standard of care, but more people end up dying in institutions, either nursing homes or hospitals, rather than in their own homes. So anyway, always trying to look at a humane way of dying, passing away. Since a person has the right to prepare for his or her death while fully conscious, he or she should not be deprived of consciousness without a compelling reason. Okay, this is certainly expressing a belief in eternal life and to prepare for death, and respecting if the person has a belief in eternal life, then, well, time to prepare has come, to the last preparation. And so not put people unconscious without giving them an opportunity to prepare, including calling the pastoral care team if they want to see a priest or a rabbi or an imam, whoever. I always bring the Baptist system as an example. I go back to the 80s here in Miami and 70s where both Mercy Hospital and Baptist Hospital were standalone hospitals. Now they're both part of a system, competing systems. But Baptist, the original one, was there, and the one that's still there in Maine, which is on Kendall Drive, south near Dayland. Anyway, they've always had a very, very good pastoral care team, and it's totally integrated to the healthcare provision.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
It says that it shouldn't be deprived
Of consciousness?
So you said that they have the rights, for example, to say please.
Yes.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
for final confession?
Yeah, exactly.
Like the last rite?
In the last rites, we have actually a sacrament of the 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church. The last sacrament, the anointing of the sick, is geared specifically to people who are dying or seriously ill. And it is a sacrament. And even if the person is unconscious, that sacrament forgives sins. So it's a very...
But for euthanasia, that's morally sinful.
Right, objectively, yes. But we never pass judgment on the conscience of the person, all right? Typically, the people who ask for this, they have all kinds of issues going on.
Is a priest allowed to give absolution?
Yeah, but before or after the act, because if the person has already committed euthanasia, the sacraments are not for the dead; they're for the living. Okay, so that's precisely the first one. See, if a person is seeking euthanasia, then that person should be giving care and psychological and spiritual support, and try to convince not to do it and to seek other remedies, all right, including sedation and so forth, so that they can pass away and die a natural death, but not kill themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If someone wants to do that, shouldn't.
Yeah, in other words, the priest cannot give them the okay if that's what you're asking. Yeah, if they want to do euthanasia, you try to convince them otherwise and so forth with the whole team, and maybe try to get some family members or whoever is significant in the life of that person, right? But let's look at a little bit more detail of what is involved here. The person, of course, is going to be suffering or in pain, in a lot of pain. Well, there's pain management also that can be done, even to the point of what is known as terminal sedation, which means continue to manage the pain until the person falls unconscious, all right? And then at least there's no more pain. Whether it's suffering or not, we can't really tell because the person is unconscious and they cannot express it. But there is a way of managing pain to the hilt, typically morphine or some analog. The point here is that it's a very thin but real distinction between killing the person, or euthanasia, or the person killing himself or herself, or just allowing the person to die. The last sentence here: patients experiencing suffering that not can be alleviated should be helped to appreciate the Christian understanding of redemptive suffering. This is a particular contribution that I think is it's actually in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the basis of a lot of the spiritual grounding of the culture in the Western Hemisphere is Judeo-Christian in our tradition, that there is a value, there is a redemptive value to suffering, all right? If the suffering, the pain can be alleviated by painkillers, essentially. But the suffering is more subjective, it's a different thing. How do you do with, what do you do with suffering? To try to help the person understand that that suffering has redemptive value if it's offered up, if it's put in a spiritual context, it has tremendous value. It's hard to make these arguments today because people just shun pain and suffering as if we were allergic to it, all right? And all tremendous efforts are being made all the time to prevent pain and suffering and to make our lives as comfortable as possible. So there's kind of a social allergy to pain and suffering. And yet, when it's put in the context of spirituality, it has tremendous value to it. But it is a value, it's a system of belief. Okay, let me move forward because we're running out of time. It's important to distinguish between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, okay? Because at least to date, euthanasia is still illegal in the United States for a person to kill somebody else. In this case, for a doctor or a medical profession to kill a patient. That would be euthanasia. However, physician-assisted suicide is legal in the United States in an increasing number of states already. It's 8 states already. It is legal, all right? The acronym, you see it around PAD or PAD, physician-assisted suicide. And euphemisms for that is physician-assisted death. Sorry, this was passed. What these euphemisms try to do is they try to take the sting away from suicide, right? And so they talk about physician-assisted death, or physician aid in dying, or medical aid in dying. These are all the acronyms that are used, or simply aid in dying. But they all mean the same thing. This is the person, the patient, killing himself or herself, but with the aid of the doctor. Why? Because the patient cannot self-prescribe. These are medications that are basically, it's like a 2-level. First, the person goes unconscious, and then the next action is to stop the heartbeat, essentially. Okay? And so the patient, the physician has to prescribe those medications. And that's why it's physician-assisted, right? But it's the person killing himself or herself. And this has become legal in an increasing number of states. I'll show you the list in a minute. So you understand the distinction between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. In euthanasia is a doctor directly killing someone else, injecting the dosage, either with syringe or given the pill. But in physician-assisted suicide is the patient who is killing himself with the assistance of the doctor, because the medication has to be prescribed by a doctor. Okay, so here's the list. It started in Oregon in '94, okay, and Washington State also, and of course, California could not be left behind. So the 3 states on the West Coast already have legalized euthanasia. And then,
They offer euthanasia?
I'm sorry, physician-assisted suicide, yes. Mhm. The most recent one is Hawaii, the beginning of this year. Okay, it was hailed as a great victory for the camp that is in favor of this, of course. One thing to keep in mind here, well, technically DC, District of Columbia is not a state, right? It's a district, but I included in the list so that it's a total of 8 entities in the United States that have already accepted physician-assisted suicide. And again, what's in this list is not diminishing, the list is increasing. There are about 24 states right now that are on target for euthanasia to be legalized. And again, they do it at the state level, try to pass laws that will allow for physician-assisted suicide. And Florida is one of those states, including a number of other, about 2 or 3 dozen states are also part of that action, legislative action, year after year. In a sense, one thing that has prevented the state legislature of Florida to pass a physician-assisted suicide is precisely the case of Terri Schiavo, which was so gruesome for, she was essentially starved to death for several days, and it was such a convoluted and complicated issue here in the state of Florida that no legislator wants to touch the issue because truly it's politically a bad thing. It's not a popular theme. So bottom line with regards to both euthanasia and physician-assisted death is that they are intrinsic evils. They should always be avoided because people will get desperate when they're in pain or in suffering, but killing themselves is not really a solution. It's diametrically opposed to the first principle of medicine, which is do no harm, all right? And especially when there are alternatives. There are alternatives to people killing themselves. And what's even adds insult to injury is now getting the medical profession involved in killing their patients instead of healing their patients. So what alternatives then? Okay, I already talked about the relative value of suffering. Let me move on to alternatives. Well, hospice or palliative care. Okay, in other words, there's no more cure for the person. The person is actively dying, but care always obligates. And the 2 options that we have are either hospice or palliative care. They vary somewhat in different ways in the place where they occur, the timing, and the payment, and the treatment. So let's look at that for a moment. With regards to hospice, it's more at home. Palliative care is more in a hospital or a clinical setting. For hospice, the timing is typically 6 months, but that's just a standard. I mean, no one is going to tell you, can say beforehand, well, you're going to die in 6 months or within 6 months. And then you have a very broad range. People who are given 6 months to live may die the next week, or they may go on 4 or 5 years after that. Okay, so it's just a standard to put some kind of a number out there, not drag it out the whole year, but give it some time for the person to get their issues resolved. So typically hospice uses 6 months as a standard. In palliative care, there's no specific time really, because it also accepts conditions that are chronic, which are not necessarily terminal, long-term, but they also apply for palliative care. Chronic conditions. The payment may be different also because some insurance doesn't cover hospice, even though Medicare does for the elderly or disabled. Palliative care, it is the hospital that bills, so whatever system that hospital is using, which is typically an insurance, right? So the method of payment varies between these two. And finally, the mode of treatment can vary somewhat because even though they're both care, all right, hospice focuses is more hands-off and keeping the person comfortable. A few medications or treatments, if any, all right, it's just basically keeping the person comfortable. And if they're going to be on pain medication, then monitoring that so that there is sufficient medication for killing the pain and not killing the patient, as we say. All right, so it comes down to a dosage, the amount of painkiller that is given to the patient. Whereas for palliative care, since they are in a hospital setting or in some kind of an institutional setting, then there could be some life prolonging therapies available and maybe more medications, for example, antibiotics and so forth. In general, hospice tends to not try not to provide antibiotics, whereas for palliative care, yes. So these are some differences, but these are alternatives to euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. Okay, one subset of this is known as terminal sedation. It's a special case when the person is in intractable pain, what they call intractable pain, and they just cannot, the painkillers are no longer doing their job, okay? Speaking of painkillers, the technical term is analgesic. So analgesic is a pain killer, and not to be confused with a sedative, which is for sleeping, all right, or rendering the person unconscious. So the two types of medications, analgesics, which typically are from the opioid family, or and sedatives, which are different compounds, but they should not be confused because a patient typically will need both of these in different dosages. So the idea here is to relieve the stress in a terminally ill person in the last hour or days, okay? So here's definitely hours or days is a short time frame. We're not talking about even weeks or months. So the person is dying already, is actively dying. But because, again, not all the organs die at the same time, then some types of illnesses are very painful. For example, bone cancer and other diseases of the neurological system are going to be very painful. It's a continuous intravenous or subcutaneous infusion, and if they cannot get a line, what do you mean by a line? Yeah, a needle pick or line to a needle into the vein system to drip in the medication. Sometimes it can be given in extreme situation, administered through a rectal catheter, all right, where the large intestine will essentially absorb, because the large intestine is involved in absorbing mostly water and fluids, right? Okay, so there are ways of managing this and administering the medication, whether it's an analgesic or a sedative, and the sedative will sedate the person, will put them to sleep, but in the real sense, not kill them. The idea here is that the person will be sedated so that the terminal illness will progress and terminate finally to its full expression, which is to have the person die naturally. In other words, whatever vital organ is failing, that will finally fail totally. So you see the distinction between killing or allowing to die. Killing is not acceptable bioethically, whether by euthanasia or physician-assisted, but allowing to die, yes, we have to allow people to die because we're all going to die sooner or later, all right? But it's a big difference. It's a critical distinction, and I can tell you that most people don't make this distinction. They don't know how to make it. They don't want to make it because it's a very utilitarian thing. If people are in pain, well, let's put them out of their misery, okay? So from a bioethical perspective, we make a big distinction between killing or allowing a person to die, which we have to sooner or later by providing the proper care for that person until the illness runs its course. I don't have time, but I'd like to look at some case studies here. One is the Hemlock Society. Let me see. Just here so you can see them. Which eventually started as a Hemlock Society, hemlock being the poison that Socrates took at his trial. And it's a plant, it's a poison that is lethal, right? Which has now evolved into a new name called Compassion and Choices. This is the main group today pushing for euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in the United States and other parts of the world. Okay. And then at least a couple of names that are significant in pushing for this is Dr. Jack Kevorkian. Ever heard that term? Mm-hmm. Right, he died now. And then the lady is double N or double T? Brittany Maynard. Ever heard that name? Brittany Maynard? No? Okay, Brittany Maynard lived in California. She's a young lady who developed gliocytoma, the brain, a brain tumor, which was, yeah.
She used to go into, is she the one that used to go into TV and talk about
yes.
that, and she made like a huge campaign?
Yes, she did a huge campaign. Yes, Brittany, sadly, she got a brain tumor that was terminal, was not operable, but there's a partial procedure that they do, sectoring the brain. They take out pieces of the brain to alleviate some of the symptoms, but it's incurable. And she was married, no children, and at that time in California it was illegal. So physician-assisted suicide. So she moved to Oregon and had to be there for 6 months to become a resident, because only residents have access legally. And then she committed suicide. She got the prescriptions from the doctor. And she says, but what is very disturbing about this is that in the case of Brittany Maynard, well, tell you what, because I don't want to run over the time already. Look up these 4 words, all right? Even if it's just Wikipedia, it's enough to get a feeling of what's going on. Look up these 4 words, and we'll talk about them briefly on Monday, because this is basically what's happening out there. There's a shift in the practice of medicine, and it's becoming increasingly more popular to get doctors, the medical profession, to participate in killing their patients rather than seeking to heal and to provide comfort to them, okay? And this is all because of a utilitarian mentality of the principle that if it works, do it. Don't worry about the ethics, just if it works, you know. And it's also another issue here is the absolute interpretation of patient rights, you know, to interpret patient rights in an absolute way. In other words, that I have a right to take my own life, which just suicide as a whole in society is still illegal. But this particular subset, physician-assisted suicide, is legal in some states, which is very paradoxical. All right. Okay, let me stop here. So, questions, comments? No? All right, we'll meet again on Monday, and then we go from there. I'll send you the little video on the PowerPoint. Okay, thanks again for being here. And may you have a good weekend.